You walked into that appointment with the same questions that you had going in. You didn't say anything wrong per se, but the full symptom history never made it into the room. And if this has happened to you more than once, it doesn't mean that you said anything wrong, but it also doesn't mean that the provider doesn't care. The biggest culprit is that appointments weren't designed to fully encapsulate all of the symptoms you've been having, especially if they've been recurring for more than several months. The even bigger issue is that there aren't many workarounds on how to address these appointments to make sure that you're being heard. But this is why I'm making this video. Before we talk about how to fully prepare for an appointment, it's important to understand why this happens. If you don't get the backstory or the gist of why the mechanics happen the way they do, none of the techniques will make sense. Here's what most people don't know about what goes into the appointments and what happens right before you even step foot in the office. Every appointment gets classified before the provider steps foot into the room. Whether it's routine or diagnostic, it's not administrative tasks. These type of appointments address what the provider is obligated to focus on during that appointment. A routine appointment has a certain direction. With diagnostic appointments, they're typically brought up by a certain concern and now changes the trajectory on what the provider evaluates and has obligations to evaluate. Which means if you booked a general appointment hoping that certain concerns would be addressed, the appointment type may have already limited what could be shared or the time allotted for you to share those concerns. And this isn't just a conspiracy. It's based on the type of billing structure that most patients don't know exist. The second thing that's working against you is your chart. Your medical record is not a neutral document. It's a narrative. Every appointment, every previous visit, every inconclusive visit, and anything that's been routed to stress or anxiety creates a filter for your next appointment that the provider is going to read through. Research in clinical psychology calls this anchoring bias. When a chart contains a history of inconclusive visits, providers unconsciously discount or dismiss those current complaints the patient is having. And it's not done intentionally or maliciously. It is a cognitive shortcut that clinical training does not eliminate. And the third, the format itself. A 15-minute appointment was designed for acute symptoms. What does that mean? Something new, something visible, and something contained. It's typically not built for those issues that have been occurring for months and also crosses over into that threshold of mental health territory. And simply put, especially if you're dealing with chronic issues and you're treating with multiple providers, this format fails you structurally. And most people try and walk into their appointments trying to figure everything out under this pressure without any external support. That is where things get missed. I used to work in healthcare, and what I saw in all of these roles is the same kind of reoccurring thing. There was a disconnect. This disconnect was from the everyday person that showed up to those appointments and the provider that had the clinical background and training to be able to assist this person. It's two people in the same room, both trying, but there's still a gap that seemingly exists. And this gap is particularly not one's fault. I worked in personal injury case management. I worked front desk at a mental health clinic. I've even worked alongside providers, attorneys, and clients and saw how information either moved or didn't move, and where there was information that still needed to be relayed. And one thing that I kept seeing was this. A client would know something very important about their health, whether this was a pre-existing injury, whether this was a result of something that happened before an accident, or it could have been something that their therapist flagged. All of this information, and it wouldn't be relayed or communicated to the provider that's currently treating them. And the reasons are often because a patient or a client believes that this information being relayed could hurt them, that it didn't matter, or it was irrelevant to bring up. But here's what they don't understand. The provider can only document what they're given, and what gets documented becomes the ceiling. The ceiling is what gets authorized, what is the focus for the next appointment, and what actually gets taken seriously. And the provider was not wrong. They're only documenting and treating on the information that they have available to them. But incomplete information produces incomplete outcomes for the person who needs the help the most. I'm not here to penalize the providers or the clients. That's not the point. The point is, you are the only person in your healthcare experience that holds the full picture. Your therapist sees one portion, your provider sees another, and a specialist may see the third portion. But no one is talking to each other in the way you need them to, which means the gaps that exist between these providers and what actually gets addressed lives with you. And my goal, the whole reason of Keyview Insight Center, is to close and mitigate that gap. And you as the client You don't need credentials to receive good care, but knowing and understanding the system gives you a voice within it. So here is what patients that actually receive answers do differently. They typically aren't louder or more aggressive. They come in organized. They bring in documentation. They asked what was ruled out instead of what was found. They make sure that the concerns that they have are on record before they leave. And as you can see, none of that requires a medical degree. It requires a system. Most patients walk into their appointment with a mental list. They rehearse what they want to say, and then as soon as the provider walks in and asks their first question, the whole conversation gets redirected. And by the time you're wanting to share what you wanted to mention, you forgot half of what you wanted to talk about. And this is not a memory issue. Your nervous system is operating under clinical pressure and is shifting to survival, so half of what you were wanting to mention is no longer important in your mind under these circumstances. And this just is simply biology. The solution isn't for you to try and remember more or force yourself to remember. Let's just completely remove memory out of the equation. When someone says, I've been exhausted for 8 weeks, rest doesn't help, and it's affecting your day-to-day task, that pattern requires a different level of attention. It's the same symptom, but different clinical weight. And the difference is how it was communicated. So here's the actual preparation system. The night before your appointment, write down your top 3 concerns and rank them by what's affecting your day-to-day task the most. And that distinction matters because providers respond to functional impact. And for each of these concerns, write down 4 things. How long this has been happening, how often does it occur, how it affects your daily functioning specifically, and what treatments or things you've already tried. This format gives your provider a pattern, not a complaint. Patterns require clinical responses. Complaints get reassurance. And the second piece of this is your opening statement. Most people come into appointments allowing the providers to lead the conversation. That immediately takes control out of your hands and the direction of what gets mentioned. Instead, prepare 1 sentence so you can redirect the conversation. You can say, before we get started, I would like to flag 3 specific concerns I want to address before we leave that I have written down. That sentence does 3 things. It signals that you're organized. Providers respond differently to clients that are organized. It also sets the tone and the agenda of the appointment. Lastly, it puts on record what exactly your concerns are before the conversation is redirected. The third piece is actually understanding what your appointment is. If you're dealing with a specific concern that hasn't been fully evaluated, this type of appointment is typically going to be a diagnostic one, not a routine. So when you book this appointment, say, I have a specific ongoing concern that I want evaluated, not just monitored. That language within itself already signals diagnostic before you even arrive, and also change the scope on what the provider is obligated to address. The fourth piece of this is asking what actually has been ruled out. Most patients only lean on what actually has been found. Asking this requires the provider to account for their diagnostic processes. A provider who has been thorough should be able to answer this easily, whereas a provider who's simply defaulted it to something like stress or anxiety now has to openly acknowledge that. In this case, you're being informed and you're not being combative, just asking this. Now, here is the layer that most people miss. All of this preparation applies to one single appointment, but most people dealing with complex and chronic issues are typically treating with multiple providers. They could be treating with a therapist, they could be seeing their primary care doctor, and they can also be seeing a specialist. And all of these providers are operating at different systems. They have different notes, different priorities, and different definitions of what counts as relevant. And in most cases, as we know, they're probably not communicating with each other. You're the only provider who sits across from both of them, which means you're the only one who can bridge the gap on what's actually missing. And this doesn't mean to do more work. It's just reframing your mind to understand that you're the only person that has the full picture. It can provide those pieces for each of those providers. When you bring your notes in from your therapy session to your medical appointment, you're not oversharing. You're giving your medical provider context on things they can now see. And on the flip side, if you're bringing documentation from your medical appointments to your therapist, you're not deflecting. You're giving your therapist a full clinical picture. And this is exactly what advocacy looks like. It's not being louder, it's not being more persistent, it's being more organized, more specific, and more informed on how the system works. So I built something exactly for this issue. It's called the Free Appointment Kit. It walks you through the exact preparation we talked about in this video, the concern from documentation format, and the opening statement you should present when you first join your appointment. It also has questions that you should ask before, during, and after your appointment. And there's also language included in there if you feel dismissed and how to push back without being confrontational. And all of this is free. I even have some other free resources and paid options that help you along this clinical journey. I will link my website and the link to this resource in the description and in the bio. So I ask that you take this to your next appointment. The goal of this is not to say that you're going to become your own doctor by any means. It is to make sure that the people that are actually responsible for your care have enough information to make an informed decision. You're not asking for more, you're asking for accuracy. And this distinction changes everything.